It's a good idea to start from Sabina, why connectivity is important, and you move to the political situation. They don't have a government now, so lots of parties are discussing. You had the shrink, which we discussed last time with Eric. Now they are talking about the transfer passenger tax.
Yeah.
In addition to the huge increase of OMD tax.
Because everything you say is just, we can immediately kind of record. So I think we don't want to waste the time, right? So the transfer passengers right now are not taxed. Origin destination passengers have to pay extra. Transfer passengers not. Now there are policy discussions about changing this. So what do you think? How high is the chance that the Dutch government will decide to basically implement a tax on transfer passengers? They have been quite radical in the past, right, with their ideas about cutting flight numbers. So I would say, that to me, I wouldn't be too surprised if they would move in that direction.
Well, the Netherlands, they have a very wide political spectrum from very left-wing parties to very right-wing parties. And it's a very scattered landscape. And what you do see is that for the moment, there's no government. They are making the government for the moment. And all these parties have different ideas. But to my surprise, the majority of these parties is not really aviation-friendly. They have already decided, most of them want to increase the departure tax, even up to about €70, which is about $80 for a number of long-haul destinations. In addition, a number of parties are discussing to levy a transfer tax on transfer passengers. And this is rather unique because I don't know any country which really levies a transfer tax on transfer passengers, because that really hurts your home airline.
I mean, and the departures, and at least in Hong Kong, I can say, and also at other airports, it is true that all passengers have to pay. For all passengers, the airport will charge on a per passenger basis. And typically, it's the way that for origin destination passengers, those charges will typically be higher than for transfer passengers. So already there is some kind of there seems some discount for transfer passengers. And I guess this is also true in Schiphol right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So the airport charges, indeed, there are charges for transfer passengers, as there are charges for departing passengers for security and the usage of the airport. Absolutely. But this here is a government tax, which does go to the airport. It goes to the government, and the government just puts it in a normal tax income.
Right.
And
okay.
The origin destination tax in the Netherlands is already one of the highest in Europe. The previous government already decided that. Now discussing to make this even higher. Some countries in Europe are lowering this one, but the Dutch government decided to make it higher. But in addition, some parties are requesting a transfer tax on transfer passengers. And this is rather unique.
And I feel, getting back to the per passenger charges and them being lower for transfer passengers, typically, my explanation for this is that the transfer passenger market is much more competitive than the market for origin destination passengers. So if for instance, if I fly from Hong Kong to Berlin, of course I can change. I can transfer in Schiphol, but there are so many other places that I can transfer. It's such a long list. I don't want to even start with listing all of them. So for me, the explanation why the airports charge transfer passengers lower prices, in my feeling, one explanation could be the competitive situation. Now, why do I mention this? If that would be true, and these markets are really competitive, then has some implication on how a tax on transfer passengers could work. Because if the market is very competitive, relatively small changes in the cost for transfer passengers could have quite substantial effects on the share, on the number of transfer passengers, because they are airlines and passengers are price sensitive, and then they would respond by just not using Schiphol in significant numbers. Would you agree with this? With this idea that.
But I look at it from another angle, of course. This transfer tax is included in the ticket price. and the home carrier of Amsterdam is KLM. And if they're selling a ticket, Berlin to San Francisco, connecting in Amsterdam, I mean, the price is what the price is, no? So this transfer tax, is it 10 or 15 or whatever euro, that is included in the ticket. So you do take it away from the home carrier, who has to be competitive. And you may not forget that Amsterdam has a rather small hinterland if you compare it to Paris or London. So Amsterdam Schiphol is really dependent on transfer passengers because it doesn't have enough passengers to fill a daily flight to Amsterdam to Los Angeles, Amsterdam to San Francisco, Amsterdam to Seattle. So it really needs to look for passengers in Berlin and Hamburg.
But let me just before we go there, I'm still not entirely convinced by or what you just said, because I think the threat is more real than the way you have described it. What you just said is basically, okay, the ticket prices are given, the cost of transfer passengers is higher, this will reduce the margin, right? The yield for the airlines, and that is bad for airlines, and therefore they will reduce their activities in the transfer passenger markets. I think this is only part of the story. Why? Well, typically we think, how do we explain prices? There are several factors, but definitely one of the factors should be the cost. So if the cost increase, typically what we would be expecting is that the airlines will be responding by increasing the ticket price. And if the ticket price increase, that certainly has an effect also on passengers and passenger demands. So, and my feeling is that these demands the transfer passengers are quite sensitive with respect to changes in the prices. And I could be a good example. If I can save a few bucks by just transferring somewhere else, I would do this.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. But of course, if your ticket price is too high, as you say, passengers will switch to another hub. So it's not good for the airport. It's not good for the airline. If this transfer tax is being done all over Europe, then the competitive position of Amsterdam would not be so bad, because all the ticket prices would go up. Here, the marginal cost for an extra passenger is almost zero. KLM really needs these passengers, so they would probably take an even bigger loss on these transfer passengers because
this is because of what you just said with the hinterland, right? Yeah, because you said that the hinterland is not so. Basically, is not sufficient in order to support such a huge airline network.
Yeah, and that's a fantastic business model. KLM started with that many years ago, and it always played in the top rank of European airlines. And if you look at the Netherlands is not a huge country. It just has 18 million people living there, but it has a huge network, huge airline network, and that really is very beneficial for them. And they really could attract multinationals and all of that thanks to that network. And that network was fed basically through linking their very strong intercontinental network with many small, thin routes to almost 100 European destinations.
And I would highlight that, and of course, this sounds to me convincing. But of course, we also have some we like aviation, right? So this sounds convincing to me. So people may be wondering, but is there some real quantitative evidence? And usually there is a big problem with deriving this empirical evidence, and this has to do with something that economists really like to talk about, this causality. Typically, if you have a strong region and there is a lot of air traffic, now the question is, do you have such a large network because the region is strong, or is the region strong because you have this large airline network? What you just said is you highlighted the relationship, saying, our large airline network or good connectivity supports the economy and makes it stronger. And actually, there is a good study, a really quite sophisticated methodology published in 2018 by Campante and co-author. It's a little bit complicated name, so I didn't remember. And they exactly find that. They use some really kind of interesting and good. They have a very sophisticated methodology, and that kind of supports what you just said. and this is that connectivity matters for economic development. So if you would do something that reduces connectivity, this is likely going to have some impact, negative impact, actually, on economic activity.
And the fact is that Amsterdam Schiphol, KLM, is over-reliant on transfer passengers. And that's what whole the political discussion is about. Do we really need all these flights just to cater for other people? If you look at, for instance, British Airways, they have about 20% of transfer passengers. Air France, I think it's more or less the same. And if you look at KLM, it's about 50% of the passenger transfer passengers. The other side of the spectrum is, of course, Qatar Airlines. About 90% of the people are transferring there. But if you're over-reliant on transfer passengers, means if you have a transfer tax, as we just said, you potentially increase your prices or you lose on margin, which means that you are have to cut a number of routes which are not profitable anymore, because if you lose your feeding, you probably lose a number of intercontinental destinations, and that's how the whole network starts to shrink with the impact we just discussed.
Exactly. So now I wanted to say something, but I forgot what I wanted to say. Wait a second. And
there's also an impact for the Dutch passengers, because if you have less feeding flights in the morning and the evening, which means you have less connectivity to a whole range of European destinations. And in addition, if you're losing this transfer passengers, the prices for the Dutch passengers will increase. They will have less choice. They probably have longer travel times. They have less frequencies, or in the worst case, they have to move to foreign airports.
Well, basically, they will experience what you're experiencing right now, because that's what you just said, right? You said, you have a very good connectivity, but indirect connectivity, and what they have is a lot of direct connectivity.
Yeah.
And so I think this is something important to highlight, is that this extensive network is possible only because of the large share of transfer passengers. Otherwise, it would not be economically possible to maintain, or it would make sense. But this is also, the local passengers really, really benefit from this, because they have, high frequencies, dense, basically they can fly anywhere, anytime. And this is very convenient, and not only for businesses, but also, of course, for just the regular traveler, leisure traveler, or so. So this is, I think, something. So what you're indicating is that they may not appreciate this as much as they should. But at least, now with this kind of discussion, with your article, the information is there. Some other people highlight this again, and then ultimately it's a decision, right? For them, if you really think this is something, I don't care so much about that, knowing that there are some, there are some disbenefits from having a lower connectivity and fewer transfer passengers, lower connectivity, lower frequencies, and so on and so forth. Then, if that's a conscious decision, then that would also be fine, right? But I think our job right now is just to make it transparent and say, okay, there is actually a lot of benefits for you from this kind of, quite good and dense network.
Yeah. And the issue I personally have is that many political parties are using the environmental reasons why they put a transfer tax, but that doesn't make any sense. As you know, transfer passengers take whatever they can. If they cannot transfer to Amsterdam, they probably transfer to London or Frankfurt or another airport. So you just move the traffic around. You don't diminish the traffic. And that's something I have a problem with. And that's what I wanted to highlight in my opinion, that you're making the Netherlands smaller by putting a transfer tax for transfer passengers.
Right. This is
increasing the tax on the origin and the departure. If you do that, what they currently are doing, you push a number of leisure passengers out of the Netherlands towards Belgium and towards Germany. These are the point-to-point, the direct flight. That's another discussion. And I think it's a very interesting discussion to see what is going on, because it's a rather unique discussion.
I think we should, in this context, when we talk about environment, and of course we often talk about climate, and I think in your article you also talk about climate, then I think it makes a lot of sense to talk about how does the EU emission trading scheme fit into this picture. And I think this is actually quite interesting, and that could actually provide perhaps some support, I would say, for the notion of having a tax on transfer passengers. Let me explain. So what we have is the EU ETS, and that caps the total emissions in Europe, and it covers aviation, but only intra-European flights and not extra-European flights. But of course, transfer passengers, a large part of this will be extra-European. And you could say that transfer passengers, well, they are not, they should, of course, it would be great to have them in part of the, included in the EU ETS, but for political reasons that apparently was a little difficult. Interestingly, for the maritime sector, this has happened. It's included that extra European voyages with vessels, shipping vessels, are actually part of included in the EU emission trading scheme. But for aviation, that's not true. And so you want to cover this somehow, and therefore you have the tax on the transfer passengers. I would feel this is actually an argument which somehow there's some. You can't rule it entirely out. That could be a positive effect.
I don't follow, to be honest, Achim, because if you fly Frankfurt-Chicago with United Airlines, you don't pay any ETS. You're just subject to the ReFuelEU. You have to take the 2% stuff.
That's correct.
If you fly with KLM from Frankfurt to Amsterdam, and then you connect Amsterdam to Chicago, you do pay the ETS part between Frankfurt and Amsterdam. So it's even almost more fair because at least the European part is covered. So this is, in fact, opposite to what you've just said.
I see. So I think so I don't, to be honest, I always like to add the EU emission trading scheme to the picture. But as we can tell from our discussion right now, it's not trivial. It's not straightforward.
No,
obviously,
I think at least that part is covered, while nothing is covered.
Right. So I think
I'm not saying that transferring is good for the environment, because a direct flight is always better. But what it also helps, and I think, and that's good for the environment, is that you increase the load factor by having so many passengers. You increase the load factor, and the marginal cost for an extra passenger is almost zero anyway. So it's not so bad for the environment on the other side.
Well, I think this is not to be underestimated. I mean, we are talking about making good use of the fleet of aircraft. The fleet of aircraft is something that is very expensive, and you really want to, and there are environmental costs, but of course there are just other costs as well. So just a regular cost, basically. So they're very expensive, and you really want to have a system that makes a good use of this, like very capital intensive assets. And a hubs and spoke network, I feel, for these like really long distance flights, it's just economic. And so there's also, and I also think that from the environmental perspective, if we would just have all these long distance flights, we would have small aircraft flying direct rather than having bigger aircraft flying indirect and having those feeder flights. I would say, for me, it's not straightforward that what we are having right now is ultimately more costly for the environment than flying more direct. I don't know.
Yeah,
that's a lot of speculation.
Anyway, the CO2 emissions per seat for an A350 are very similar to the ones of an A321 crossing the ocean. So it's not so different. And in addition, an A350 has cargo on board as well. So I think it's really comparing apples with pears, that's this type of discussion. But what's the fact that you should price emissions and not the transfers? And there I follow you. Ideal, the ETS is valid all over the world. Ideal, ReFuelEU, the SAF mandate is valid all over the world, and that would simplify matters significantly. And with this, I know that could be topic of another podcast, you create an unequal level playing field as it is now. But it's not a fact that transfer passengers pay less for the CO2 emissions. On the contrary, they pay more because for the European leg, they have to pay for the ETS. And as you know, from the 1st of January 2026, 100% of the emissions have to be covered by ETS certificates. So 100% of your CO2 is compensated for.
So if we're talking about, maybe we just talk a little bit more about this. So what we have is, okay, so we are talking about a long distance flight. We're talking about hub and spoke network, and we have the feeder flights which are covered by the EU ETS, and the long distance flights which are of course contributing much more to basically carbon emissions. They are not covered by the EU ETS. There is the ReFuelEU, which right now of course is still very low in terms of the SAF requirements. Is it like 2% or 3 or 4%?
Until 2030, then it goes up to 6.
Yeah, so it's still relatively low. So I feel like overall, we would say, and of course, there's also CORSIA. That's a global scheme. But overall, I would say the mechanisms are not such that you would say that the international, the long haul flights, which are part of this hub and spoke network, are right now properly taxed. Would you disagree with this?
No, I agree. Europe is a front runner with ETS. The system works well in Europe, and it's a fantastic system. And ReFuelEU is a bit of a challenge because it can create an unequal level playing field in the longer term, meaning that 2% is still okay, but you know, SAF is 3 to 4 times as expensive. But if you have a flight, for instance, from Frankfurt to Tokyo, Lufthansa has to buy 2% of SAF, later on 6%. If you fly Turkish Airlines also has to do that, but only the 2%, 6% later between Frankfurt and Istanbul, if you connect. And then from Istanbul, it doesn't matter. So Turkish Airlines has a competitive advantage anyway. And that's the whole discussion which is currently ongoing in Europe. ETS is fine. All the European airlines have to pay it. They don't like it, of course, but it's a very good system, and it's a very fair system as well. ReFuelEU is a bit of a tricky one.
So for the let's sort of finish the discussion with the tax on transfer passengers. I think what you are highlighting is really for the locals, for those who are living nearby Schiphol Airport, transfer passengers are important because they help support this really very high quality network, connecting lots of different places with high frequencies. Without transfer passengers, this would not happen. And you need a hub airline for this. And the Brussels airport is kind of an example for a situation where you don't have a hub airline and you don't have those large share of transfer passengers, leading to a much lower, fewer connections and much lower frequency. So I think this is maybe the one of the lessons. And the other is I still feel that from the environmental perspective, talking about climate, I think you can create an argument. Of course, what you're highlighting is, well, if it's an environmental problem, just use the environmental policies and don't try to, get to the core of the problem, and don't try to fix it somehow, because typically if we are trying to do this, there are some other effects that will happen which are unintended and which could be at the end could be quite bad. Yeah,
and do it on a European scale if you want to do that.
So
And
what you're
ideally
saying
work
is,
streaming, yeah.
so would you say a transfer, a tax on transfer passengers at the European scale? That's actually a very important point, because what I just said with the climate policies, if you just have it in Amsterdam, a tax on transfer passengers, and you hope that you will have a large, substantial environmental effect, this is not likely going to happen, because the other hubs are going to just take the traffic basically, and the environmental effect should be pretty low because of this kind of intra-European leakage effect, right?
Yeah, but that doesn't mean I'm in favor of a transfer tax. I think it still doesn't make any sense to do that. But if you really, really, really want to do it then at least on a European scale. But then, of course, you have the whole discussion if you transfer through Istanbul or other hubs, which is not a European hub, then you might create a level playing field again. So I think it doesn't make any sense. I'm really in favor of taxing the emissions. And that's by far the smartest way. And intra-Europe, we have ETS, and it works very well. And let's see how we can tackle that on a worldwide scale. And we, of course, but we know all the advantages and disadvantages there.
I think we couldn't solve the puzzle, I would say, in this discussion, but that would also be beyond what you can expect from this kind of discussion. But I think what it really highlights is this is a hot issue, and I think it also deserves a more detailed discussion in order to come up with some sensible policies. Actually, luckily, the next European Aviation Conference, hosted by our friends from the University of St. Gallen, will exactly be taxes, aviation taxes. So that is something that for those of our viewers who are interested in this tax issue, and I feel like you mentioned that your LinkedIn post has been really popular. So this is kind of very indicating that this is really a topic of broad interest to a large group of people. So maybe you should consider coming to St. Gallen in November, I guess November
I'm definitely
next
coming,
year.
Achim.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Wouter.
My pleasure.